So, we lost our heroes. We were in a different system, so we're going to start a new system today. So, leave those heroes behind and come back to this one. Here's the thing. We're going to be talking about the cardiovascular system, and it might be worth taking a moment to talk about why we have one at all. So, again, in your mind, go back to being a single-celled creature. You get your nutrients from the fluid around you, you dump your waste into the fluid around you. Your warm, salty puddle. And that works just fine when you're a two-celled creature. 3, 4, 5. But here we start to run into a problem. Does everyone see what the problem is for this creature? Yeah, at least one cell has no direct access to the fluid around it. Where's it going to get its food, and when it dumps its waste, is it dumping them on its neighbor's heads? In actuality, one cell is probably not a big problem, but as you get bigger and bigger, the cells on the inside have no way of getting nutrients and no way of getting rid of waste. You can't just have a solid mass of cells. Interestingly, this is also the reason why we do not generally have cells a meter on a side, because the biochemistry inside the cell can't effectively have diffusion of materials to the rest of the cell if they're that big. They have to be small enough to have enough surface area to effectively exchange materials. Just total side note, in the very deep ocean trenches, they have found some very strange organisms that amount to single-celled amoeba-like things this big. But they have incredibly complex shapes, which gives them a great deal of surface area. It's kind of a neat thing, but totally unrelated, set it aside. Going back to this, so if we make this thing bigger and bigger and thicker and add more layers of cells, in order for it to work, we're going to have to leave some of those cells out. So that every cell retains access to the fluid outside. See how in this diagram, every cell still has at least part of its membrane available to exchange materials with the fluid outside the organism. As we make this bigger, those channels have to get more and more complicated, and then you have a problem with stuff not being able to actually travel through those channels. So you might have to start pushing fluid through it. So we actually might have to start squeezing the organism or having it move itself for such that fluid flows through these channels. And then you get to the point where you want this thing to move on to hostile dry land, which means we've got to encase it in something waterproof to keep it from drying out. Now we've got an internal watery environment that's going to all the cells. So now everybody is not exchanging with the world outside directly, but rather each cell is talking to the fluid around it, and then that fluid is exchanging with the world outside. So now if I want to get oxygen, I've got to get it from here to here, and then from here to here. Make sense to everybody? So keep making this larger and more complicated, and what you end up with is masses of cells with extremely complicated internal passages, often with pumps for moving that fluid through there. Now, if we made this big enough, we could end up with an organism where every cell was directly exposed to some fluid that circulates through the organism, but that is inside some sort of shell which prevents it from leaving. We have organisms like that. Spiders, for example, have what's known as an open circulatory system, where all of their organs, all the cells of their organs, are directly bathed in a fluid called a hemolymph, which is a combination of what the equivalent of blood and extracellular fluid. There's no difference in that organism between those two things. Blood and ECF are the same thing. It's just a common fluid that is pumped a little bit and then just sort of spread out through the internal, into the internal part of the organism so it flows over everything. A hemolymph type system, an open circulatory system, works okay if you are very small. But imagine something large like us. Imagine that inside your body, all of your organs were directly bathed in hemolymph. That hemolymph is going to tend to kind of pool in your feet. And you need some sort of pump to shove it back up to the top of your body like a fountain and just let it come down over everything again. Doesn't work very well for large organisms. So in large organisms, we make this even a little more complicated. What we end up with is cells which are in some sort of fluid That fluid is extracellular fluid. And that fluid exchanges with another fluid, blood. So in organisms like us, we have some sort of circulating system of blood where we have other organs about taking materials like oxygen into the blood and getting wastes out of the blood. And then elsewhere we have oxygen going from blood to ECF and wastes coming from ECF to blood. And then we have oxygen going from ECF to cells and waste going from cells to ECF. So we have a multi-stage exchange system. The cells are still inside their ancient warm salty bath, but now that bath exchanges with a common exchange fluid, blood, and that blood has special organs to exchange materials with the outside world. Make some sense? That's what we use, which is called a closed circulatory system.
So it's basically the inside communicating with the outside?
Hold on just a moment. Say that one more time.
It's basically like the inside communicating with the outside?
Yeah. In the end, we need to get useful stuff from out here to our cells. So in a very primitive organism, it's straight to the cell. Slightly more complicated, it's from the outside into some sort of general fluid to the cell. In us, it's from the outside to the blood, from the blood to the ECF, and from the ECF to the cell. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
This is all about how the stuff inside us exchanges material with the outside world. Once you have a closed circulatory system, though, you can do some other neat things with it. It becomes a common highway for materials to get around the body. So it's useful for sending messages, or for getting materials from one place to another quickly, or for transporting things other than chemicals. So, in highly evolved, well actually, it is wrong to call anything living on Earth currently more highly evolved than anything else. You are no more highly evolved than a virus. You and that virus have been evolving for exactly the same amount of time. You've just taken different pathways. But in highly complicated things, like humans, we have this multi-stage circulatory system. So we're going to spend some time talking about how that works, because all of the other systems we're going to talk about, respiratory, digestive, urinary, all of those are largely about this, interfacing blood to the outside world. So those organ systems are generally about getting the blood and the outside world to interchange in a useful way. Clear enough? Everyone get kind of the idea behind what we're doing here? Maybe not. As usual, I get talking about weird stuff. It's okay. So let's, using this as a model, let's sketch out in a very schematic way how the human cardiovascular system works. So first we'll make our blood vessels. Over here we'll have body tissue. That includes everything from brains to muscles to the liver, basically everything on your insides with a few exceptions. And here we have extracellular fluid, and here we have blood. Now, we want to move this blood around the body. So in order to move blood in this pipe, what do we need? We need some kind of pump. So here, let's put a pump here. So there's a pump that's going to push the stuff that way. Now, what do we need to get materials, what kind of materials do we want to get into the blood from the outside world? We need oxygen. So we're going to need some sort of organ that will let us get oxygen into the blood. What organ system is that? Yeah, the respiratory system, with the primary one being the lungs. As it turns out, the lungs are also good for another blood to outside world exchange. Carbon dioxide. As well as other things, but CO2 is the main one. So the lungs are one of our special exchange organs. It's good for getting oxygen in and CO2 out. That does a lot more than you think. CO2 is not really just a waste product. Our body actually uses it for a number of important things. One of the main ones being maintenance of blood pH. It's one of the primary chemicals involved in that. What else do we want to get into the blood? Iron, water, nutrients, vitamins, sugars, yeah, all the useful stuff, proteins, the materials that we can't make out of nothing, we have to bring in. So we're going to need some kind of organ for bringing, we'll call them nutrients, in. What organ is good for that?
Digestive.
Yeah, the digestive. Mostly the intestines, but actually multiple organs along there play a role in that. We also want to get some things out of the blood. We have wastes other than CO2. How are we going to get waste products out of the blood? Yeah, the urinary system is the main one for that. Specifically the kidneys. Now we've actually got quite a bit of stuff here. Maybe we need another pump. Okay. This seems like it would work. And just to make it more convenient, make it easier to run this thing, we'll just tie these two pumps together into one organ. That's the human circulatory system. We have a double pump, really two fundamentally separate pumps working in a unified organ. That's the heart, of course. One part of the heart pushes blood through what we call the systemic circulation, where it goes through things. This is not a particular order. These are just all things on this side of the diagram. Things like the digestive system, the urinary system, exchanges with the body tissues. And on the other side, we're going to go through the lungs, where we're going to exchange gases with the outside world. And that's it in a nutshell. Not exactly anatomically correct, but covers the concept. Questions on that? Does that seem clear to people? Do you see why we've set it up that way? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is the lymphatic system considered part of the circulatory system?
That is a good question. We're going to touch on the lymphatic system later. It's considered its own organ system, but it is closely associated with the circulatory system. So just in case you don't know, the lymphatic system is another set of vessels and organs that is effectively your body's sewage system. It takes extra fluid and debris out of your tissues, cleans it up, processes it, and returns it to your blood. We'll get to that when we talk about how capillaries work. It ties in nicely there. Others? Alrighty then. Well, we'll talk plenty about the functioning of this thing, the heart. We'll spend quite a bit of time on that. And we'll spend some time talking about the vessels themselves. But right now we're going to spend some time talking about the stuff in the vessels. Blood. Which is really pretty interesting stuff. I always get a kick out of thinking about how blood has been regarded through history. I mean, imagine you are a pre-scientific, prehistoric culture even, 10,000 years ago. You can still tell that something is special here. I mean, if you take a person and you cut them, red stuff comes out, bright red, easy to see stuff, and when enough of it comes out, they die. So logically enough, where is their life force? In the red stuff, yeah. Well, apparently you let it all out, so now they're dead. That's a totally logical conclusion to reach. The other part, of course, is that if you listen in their body, here's where you hear the sounds. And when that stops, they're dead. Okay, so that's the center of their being. That's where they are. For most of human history, when people imagine where are you, where is your soul, mind, whatever, here. It's only very recently that we've started to think of it as being here. If I remember correctly, the Greeks thought the brain was just sort of a radiator to get rid of extra heat. Well, it's not obvious what it does. It's really not barely obvious to us now. But anyway, so blood was obviously magical. And honestly, if you want to think about it really hard, think about what happens with women. Normally, blood comes out and you die, but women, once a month, bleed and don't die. Not only that, but the blood comes from the same place that babies come from. That is some powerful magic, clearly, right there. Well, I am no sociologist or historian, but my understanding is if you look at cultures, one of the really big things about them is how do they deal with menstruation? That women's activities are often heavily restricted at that time. And some people speculate it was to keep them under control because that's when their magic was most powerful. I'm not kidding here. That obviously women are the ones that guard the magic. They are the ones with the power. You got to keep a track of them because they're dangerous otherwise. Well, this is kind of probably how things were thought about. Witches, as you said. So, without getting into all that, because I don't know enough to have a useful discussion about it, suffice it to say that blood has always been seen as magical, powerful stuff. We no longer regard it as magic per se, if you're speaking scientifically. We regard it as a liquid connective tissue with all sorts of interesting stuff in it. So let's talk about that interesting stuff. Now, if I take blood out and analyze its composition, we usually divide it up into two general parts. Plasma and formed elements. This is another one of those examples where words have gotten shared among different areas of science that have nothing to do with each other. Plasma, in a physio sense, has absolutely nothing to do with plasma in a physics sense. When you're reading science fiction, they talk about their plasma rifle. They do not mean a rifle that shoots the liquid component of blood, although that would be kind of a cool idea. No, it would be really disgusting. But anyway, plasma in a physics sense is a state of matter involving things being so energetic that they have to be ions. It's usually very hot. Plasma in a physio sense is the liquid part of blood. It's the water and the things dissolved in it, the solutes. Whereas the formed elements are the cells and cell fragments. Now, how much of your blood is plasma versus formed elements is variable. It's different by people, by person. It even changes over time. You could, at an extremely rough level, say it's about half and half, but in actuality, it's not usually half and half. It depends on the person. Sometimes maybe a little more than half would be plasma, but it varies. So to an extremely rough approximation, about half. More often, more like 55, 60%. 60% is a lot. In any case, what the clinical term called the hematocrit is the percentage of your blood, which is the formed elements, primarily the red blood cells. But for right now, let's just say, let's take a look at the plasma first. By weight, plasma is about 92% water. It's one of the major water carrying areas of your body. When people talk about the body's water, they often divide it up into plasma, extracellular fluid, and intracellular fluid. With this new article they found about this new organ, the interstitium, now they're talking about that as a separate water storage area. It's a neat idea. Yeah. Some people have seen that? Yeah. The idea that the connective tissue in your body, usually when we've looked at it, it's been collapsed and dry, but in living tissue it seems to be swollen and with a network of fluid canals and special different kinds of cells. So it's a cool idea, and it's something people are now looking at. But for right now, since that's new, we're not going to talk much about it. We'll just go with this. Plasma is about 92% water. Now, has anyone ever handled plasma, gotten it on their hand and felt it? What does it feel like?
It's like kind of gooey-ish.
Yeah, I agree. To me, it's this weird combination of sticky and slippery at the same time. It's very strange stuff. The reason it feels like that is because it's about 7% protein, which is quite a bit. It's got a lot of protein. If you total this up, that's 99%. The other 1% is the ever popular other. Let's take a moment to talk about those proteins and that other. We'll move this for now. There's a whole lot of different kinds of protein in plasma. A lot of it comes from your liver. One of the main jobs your liver has is to make blood proteins and add them to the blood. Some of them come from immune cells. Some of them come from other places. But we could list a few major categories of these. One of the biggest ones is the albumins, a related group of proteins that are circulating blood proteins that serve a variety of functions. Remember when we talked about how steroid hormones often need carrier proteins to move around in the blood? Many of those carrier proteins fall in the category of albumins. Another thing that these do, which is important, is to increase the osmolarity of the blood. Having these dissolved in the blood gives it a higher osmolarity, which makes a big difference in terms of where water goes. There's some interesting stuff about this. Have you ever noticed that if you get scratched or cut, as it heals, the tissue right around it gets a little bit swollen, part of the inflammation response? One of the reasons for that is because certain signaling molecules, histamines, cause blood to leak proteins. And as the proteins leak out of the blood and into the tissues, osmotically water follows them, causing the tissues to swell up. Kind of neat. Globulins are another big one. Some hormones are globulins. There's a whole variety of different things that are globulins. One of the more interesting groups of these are the immunoglobulins, globulin proteins made from the immune system. Antibodies, for example, fall into that class. You've undoubtedly heard about antibodies. If you've taken micro, you know more about them than I'm certainly going to teach you. But antibodies are proteins which are made to latch onto specific things found in other areas. Antigens is the general term. And then signal the immune system that they have found their antigen, triggering some kind of response. If you have antibodies to something, if that enters your body, usually those antibodies glom onto it and your immune system will respond in some way. Another great one is the complement. How many people have never heard of the complement in a physio sense? Oh man. If Michael Bay were to make a movie about human physiology, the complement would be a major player in that. Really, the whole immune system would be the topic. People saw Osmosis Jones, perhaps.
Oh yeah.
Very physiologically inaccurate. Your white blood cells actually sound nothing like that. But it's still kind of, it carries the idea across that if you're looking for the action-adventure part of physiology, it's definitely the immune system. The complement, for example, is a self-assembling nanotechnological weapon. In a very literal sense, that is what it is. It's a group of proteins that, when activated, assemble themselves onto bacterial cells in something called a membrane attack complex, which then goes around punching holes in the bacterial cell and killing it. That is a cool idea. It's basically a swarm robot that assembles itself into a killing machine. So you couldn't write a better movie. It'd be a fantastic. Anyway, so before I get too excited about that. So there's lots of cool proteins running around in the blood. Oh, and so you saw Osmosis Jones. Did anyone see Fantastic Voyage? This is from the 60s. Terribly cheesy. The basic idea is that a group of people have to be put into a submarine and miniaturized to cellular size and injected into somebody's body because they need to go and get rid of a blood clot in this scientist's brain. I say cheesy, it was actually really cool at the time. You know, people, Raquel Welch gets attacked by antibodies, somebody gets eaten by a white blood cell. It's a great film. I've actually shown it in class before. Maybe we should do that. We'll have popcorn night or something. One of these labs, if I can't think of anything else to do, we'll bring it in. It's horribly cheesy, but it's fun. Anyway. Oh well, if no one's ever seen Fantastic Voyage. Okay, did you see Inner Space, the one with okay?
That's what I was gonna say. Martin Short.
There is a slight resemblance. Fantastic Voyage attempted to be physiologically accurate for what they knew at the time. Now we look at it and say, well, not exactly, no. But anyway. So, couple other ones you find here. Transferrin is an important blood protein. Its major job is to carry iron around the body. Iron is not just important in hemoglobin, it's important in a number of enzymes. So it has to be transported around the body. Transferrin is the protein that does that. Another big one, fibrinogen, which does exactly nothing until it is activated, at which point it is a major part of forming blood clots. We'll talk a little about blood clotting by the end of the lecture today, or maybe early next lecture. So, there's some examples of some of the proteins that you find in their plasma. Other would include things like ions, gases, nutrients, all the other stuff, hormones, although some of those fall under protein categories, all the other stuff you find in your blood. By weight, collectively, it's not all that much. Yeah?
That would include oxygen.
It would.
So oxygen is less than 1%.
By weight, yes. Yeah. Any other questions there? Alrighty, so there's not a whole lot else to say about plasma. If you talk about blood donation, you can donate plasma. Last I checked, you can actually be paid for plasma donation. Is that true? Yeah. You can't be paid for blood. As far as I know, it's illegal to pay people for blood donations. At least I've never heard of anyone being paid for it. It is, if I remember correctly, it is illegal to pay people for organs or for human tissue. The idea being preventing the horrible dystopian future in which people kill each other, harvest their organs, and sell them on the black market. We don't want that. So it is illegal to pay people for organs. You can pay for the services associated. Like if you donate your kidney, they can pay for all of the procedures associated, but they can't actually give you cash for your kidney. Plasma is not cellular, so I think it may be that you can be paid for that because it's not exactly a tissue. That's just a guess. I'm no lawyer. I'm less of a lawyer than a doctor, and you know exactly how seriously to take my medical
They pay
advice.
for sperm.
Sorry?
They pay for sperm.
That's okay, now with eggs, I have heard that they can't actually pay you for the egg itself. They can pay you for your time.
Oh, huh.
This is my understanding. I don't know a thing about it. But it may well be that, on your invoice, no part of it is actually being paid for the tissue itself.
Yeah.
I think sperm might be the same way, although I don't know. I could be completely wrong on this.
I know you do get
You paid like $8,000 or something crazy like that.
Oh yeah, young women with the right SAT scores and the right physical appearance can earn a lot for being
Yeah.
egg donors.
There's a lot of stuff you have to go
Mixed
through
feelings.
though. Yeah.
So I don't know if that's legally the case or not. Please correct me if you happen to know. But alrighty, so that's about all we need to say about plasma. So let's go on to the more interesting part, formed elements. Yeah, amazingly, men generally are not paid as much for sperm donation. Because, they make a lot more. Anyway. So, formed elements, there are three main groups of those. Erythrocytes, Erythro is the Greek word for red. Cyte, of course, cells, so these are red blood cells. Leukocytes. Leuko is white, so white blood cells. And thrombocytes, which would be a great band name. Like, opening for Journey, thrombocytes. You can almost see the poster. Anyway, thrombocytes are platelets, the cell fragments which help with blood clot. Just because I promised them I would. If anybody donates blood, good for you. Has anyone ever donated platelets? Did you know you could? Yeah, so the Red Cross actually loves it when people do this because they're scarcer and they don't live nearly as long. Platelets only last like 6 days outside the body. So they have to be very fresh. Often if you give platelets, it's going to somebody that day or the next day. There may be someone at the hospital like, okay, platelets, and waiting for that donation. Just so you, because I promised them I would try to sell this to my classes. I give platelets at the Red Cross, and the donation process is really pretty interesting. It's a 2-needle donation. Generally, you do 1 in each arm. They take your blood out of one side, centrifuge it, get the platelets out, and put the rest back. So it doesn't take nearly as much out of you. If you've ever donated blood, you know you give a pint, maybe 2 if they're really desperate. You come out of there a little bit like this, you know, just a little lightheaded. After a platelet donation, there's really very, very little effect on you. You are slightly less likely to clot. Try not to get in a car accident on the way home. But, you know, not that much less likely. It's not like they take all of them.
And this is who's selling it, right?
Well, so it takes longer depending on how many units they're taking. I tend to have a lot of them being relatively big. So they usually take 3 units from me, and that takes about 90 minutes. So it takes a little while. And you watch a movie, or most of them. They have some formula based on your weight, your hemoglobin levels, and estimated platelet count. They make a guess as to how many they can make safely. I have to trust them. I don't know how to trust them. But anyway, the selling point is that you want to feel good about saving lives. Platelets are usually going to people like children with leukemia, people who've had their bone marrow destroyed for cancer treatment. So they need those platelets now. So it's a nice thing. And since fewer people are willing to do it, since it takes longer, if it's something you would consider, I promised them I would make sure you considered it. Unfortunately, the closest donor center for the Red Cross is in Kearney Mesa, so it's also a bit of a drive. But think about this. If someone called you up and said, by driving to Kearney Mesa today and spending an hour and a half there, you can save somebody's life, would you do it? That was my thinking too. It's like, yeah, this is an annoying trip, but maybe somebody's life is being saved by this, so yeah, I can afford to do this. And you can do it like every 9 days if you really feel like it.
And I think they can get 3 donations from their 1 donation.
They can be separated in some way, yeah. They really value platelets if you're willing to get them.
I've gotten 7 platelet transfusions.
Really?
Yeah. So I've gotten
So you want to save her life? Yeah.
I had lost like 80% of my blood body before I was diagnosed with cancer.
Oh,
So
geez.
like the day I was diagnosed, it took like 72 hours to get all the transfusions I needed to like replace all that, and platelets was a big.
Because they
part
were
of it.
waiting, probably just
Yeah.
waiting for them to get there.
Yeah, and it was like as soon as they got there, it was like somebody was like running in to give it to me.
So in a literal sense, somebody may be waiting for your platelets, yeah. Well, I'm glad they were able to get it.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Depending on when it was, it's entirely possible it was mine. So, yeah.
They also do platelet donations at all of the mobile Red
Do
Cross
they?
ones. Yeah,
I didn't know that. They have apheresis machines at those?
they do.
Then they do it here because they do the.
Yeah, they have the blood drive here. I didn't know they did apheresis at that.
Yeah.
Do you have to be a certain weight to do it?
They do have screening criteria. I'm not sure they're
For
the same as
platelets?
the
Yeah.
blood. Because it
Because
doesn't
it's
take
not
as
as
much out
much,
of
yeah.
them. Yeah.
They prefer you to be like a donor who has done it before or is, you know,
It takes longer.
yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, ask them.
if it's something you would consider, check with the Red Cross, and they'd love to talk. In fact, they will love to talk to you so much that they will call you again and again and again, saying, "Hey, would you like to come back and donate platelets?" They're very nice about it. So, anyway, I promised them I would let you know, so now I have. Go do something wonderful if you can. For somebody, maybe say to somebody you know. Okay, any questions about that, just for the moment?
Excuse me.
Alrighty, so let's get into talking about erythrocytes while we're here. Erythrocytes, the classic red blood cell. You looked at it in the lab the other day. So, about yay big, well, not yay big, not actual size, but width is usually about 8 microns. They're small as human cells go. They're shaped typically in this sort of incomplete donut shape. There is speculation as to why they have that distinctive shape. Probably the most likely explanation is there's probably two. One, it increases their surface area, so it makes it easier for gas transfer. Another is that it probably makes them more flexible. And given that a capillary is generally about 8 microns across, they often have to bend a little bit to get through the smallest blood vessels. So they are small. They are also extremely numerous. At any given moment, you probably have something around 30 trillion of these in your body. They are by far the most numerous human cell in your body. So about 30 trillion of them in your body at any moment. Is there a question?
No, it's just the terminology is messing me up for today's test.
Oh, sorry. Is there anything I can help with? Now, the other interesting thing about human red blood cells, this is true for most mammals, but not all creatures, is that human red blood cells don't have a nucleus. They're one of the few cells in your body that lacks one. Technically, they actually have a nucleus when they are first made, but they spit it out immediately after entering your blood. They expel their nucleus and it degenerates.
When do they expel it?
Just after they're created.
Really?
They also have no mitochondria. Because they have no nucleus, they have no copies of your genome, which means they cannot make very much in the way of protein. When they're made, they may have a few copies of the mRNA needed for proteins, which they can use for a little while, but they will have very limited ability to make any new protein, which means they can't repair themselves. So they don't last very long. Red blood cells generally only live about 120 days. The fact that they have no mitochondria means that they cannot do aerobic metabolism. When they metabolize glucose, which they do, they use glycolytic metabolism. The fact that they don't use oxygen actually makes a lot of sense, though. What's their general job in your blood?
Carry oxygen.
Carry oxygen. If they used aerobic metabolism, they would just use all the oxygen, especially given that there's a lot more of them than any other kind of cell. So they are limited to anaerobic metabolism. They don't have a very high metabolic rate anyway. And if you do the math, if there's 30 trillion of them at any moment, and they only live about 120 days, you could figure out how many of them die and thus must be made every second. It comes to something like 2 million. So red blood cells are made at an incredible rate. I don't know enough about other animal physiology to guess, but I would guess that that's probably roughly comparable in most mammals. Most mammals have not too dissimilar physiology. I wouldn't swear to that. But about 2 million per second. Which also means that they're dying at an astonishing rate, which means they have to be cleared out of the blood very quickly. Go ahead.
Is it true that when you're pregnant you have to produce twice the amount of blood that you normally do?
I wouldn't think it would be twice.
Well, like another whole lot.
It wouldn't surprise, I would assume you would produce more because you have to store enough oxygen for your metabolism and the developing fetus, since they get their oxygen from you. I don't know what
And if
extra
that was
proportion.
like an old wives' tale or something.
I don't know. I would assume that you make some more, but I don't know how many off the top of my head. So these are made in bone marrow. Although I believe the liver actually has the ability to make them. It just doesn't usually. But in humans, these are made in bone marrow. When you are born, the kind of bone marrow needed to make them is found in most of your bones. But as you age, that marrow disappears from most of your bones. By the time you're your age, I believe it's found in, I think it's the humerus, the femur, the pelvis, the vertebrae, the ribs, the sternum. I'm probably missing at least a couple. But a lot of the bones in the core of the body are the only ones left that have the kind of bone marrow for this. The rate at which they're made is regulated by the hormone erythropoietin, usually just called EPO.
Lance Armstrong, that's what I was, the taking the plasma out and putting it back in the
Blood doping, athletes have been known to cheat at their events by taking synthetic erythropoietin, which will tell their bone marrow to increase red blood cell production. We'll talk a little about this later, mostly actually in the respiratory system, but more red blood cells means your blood can carry more oxygen, which theoretically improves your endurance. It has some problems. Having too many red blood cells, polycythemia, can lead to negative health consequences. So it's both against the rules and generally a bad idea health-wise. But people still do it. Normal EPO comes from your kidneys, which determine how much EPO to make based on how much oxygen is available in the blood. If you've ever gone up into the mountains for a while, you know that feeling of you go up there and you're short of breath. It feels like you can't get a full breath, you get tired very quickly. Largely, if you're at high enough altitude, that's because there's not as much oxygen in that air, your blood isn't holding as much, and it's harder to get into your tissues. That low oxygen environment tells your kidneys to make more red blood, to make more EPO, which tells your bone marrow to make more cells, and then as you end up with more cells, those symptoms are minimized. Make sense? Takes a little while. Probably a little different from the phenomenon of altitude sickness. I don't know if has anyone ever experienced that? It's an interesting one. Sometimes, and this can happen to anybody, it's not, some people are more susceptible, but it can happen that you head up to altitude and suddenly you get extremely dizzy and nauseated. And it lasts for maybe 24 hours. Probably has to do with other things than that. But this is also why athletes often train at high altitudes. It's kind of a natural way of doing the blood doping. You go up there, train for a few weeks, your body makes more red blood cells, and then after you come back down out of altitude, for about a week, you've still got more cells in your body. It works, apparently. I believe that's also why they now make those air restriction masks that some athletes train with. I know, the idea was horrible to me too. So strap something around my face that makes it harder to breathe. Sorry? It's not the same?
I don't think it's the same. It's like you're just restricting oxygen, but it's for such a limited amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's enough time for your body to be like, oh, I'm in a low, oxygen
So then why would people do it?
I think it's an endurance thing.
Huh. I'm not sure why it would increase endurance other than to cause this effect, but I don't know. It could, I don't know if that's any part of it or not. I would be willing to go with your guess on that.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
So just to clarify, you're saying that erythrocytes are made about 2 million per second
Correct.
in the bone marrow.
Yes.
And I'm confused with erythropoietin.
That's the
Where
hormone.
is it?
It's a
Oh,
hormone.
it's a hormone.
Circulated in the blood, made by the kidneys,
Okay, so it's made by the kidneys
acts on the bone marrow.
and it tells the bone marrow to make. Okay.
Correct. Make sense?
Yep.
Any other questions on that? Okay, so one more thing about erythrocytes. The cells themselves don't have a nucleus or a mitochondria. What they do have a lot of is a protein hemoglobin. Each erythrocyte contains something like 250 million hemoglobin proteins. Rather large amount of this protein. We'll talk more about hemoglobin in the respiratory system, but for now, each hemoglobin is comprised of 4 pieces, 4 subunits. Each subunit carries what's called a heme group. A heme group is not actually a protein at all. It's a separate molecule that fits into a socket in the subunit of the hemoglobin.
Say that one more time.
So the heme group is not actually part of the protein technically. It's a separate molecule that fits into a particular socket on the hemoglobin. Yeah? Yeah, one hemoglobin protein is made of 4 subunits, 4 separate pieces that fit together. Each of those pieces has a socket for one heme group. That heme group is built around one iron ion, one atom of iron. That single iron atom can hold on to one molecule of oxygen. One molecule of oxygen gas, O2. So if each hemoglobin protein is made of 4 subunits, each of which has one heme group, each heme group has one iron, and that iron can hold on to one oxygen molecule. How many oxygens can one hemoglobin protein carry? 4. If you've got 250 million hemoglobin proteins in an erythrocyte, each red blood cell can hold something like 1 billion molecules of oxygen. There are 30 trillion red blood cells approximately in your body, meaning a large number of oxygen molecules. I remember once doing some of the math about this, saying, okay, so that's where a lot of the iron in your body is. How much iron is this? How much of my body weight is iron? Turns out to be about a paperclip. The total amount of iron in your hemoglobin is a few grams worth. It's not as much as it sounds like. Make sense there? Maybe, depending on how anemic you are, but yeah. Questions on that one? Now, these red blood cells carry huge amounts of hemoglobin to carry oxygen, but they die at the rate of 2 million per second. Those 2 million red blood cells per second have to be taken out of the blood and broken down. The iron they're carrying is precious and has to be used to make more hemoglobin. So, what happens to these when they die? They're removed from the blood by the liver and the spleen. As they're broken down, by far the most plentiful component of them is the hemoglobin protein, so that's what we have to deal with. The hemoglobin is broken down and recycled. The amino acids from the hemoglobin protein are just broken down and treated like any other amino acid. They can be used to make new proteins in the body. The heme groups, though, those aren't proteins. So they have to be treated a little differently. The iron is extracted. The iron is taken elsewhere by transferrin to bone marrow, other places in the body that use iron. The rest of the heme group becomes bilirubin. That's a little simplified. There's multiple steps in it, but bilirubin is one of the main products of the heme group. One of the main things that happens to bilirubin is that it goes to the liver and is made into bile. Which is used as part of digestion. There's a few other components too. Those other components end up excreted in urine and feces, and are one of the main reasons why your urine and feces have a yellowish brown color. Bilirubin is a normal byproduct in the body, but it is a waste, and in very high amounts it can be toxic. So if a person's liver is unable to process bilirubin, for example, if you have cirrhosis of the liver or hepatitis, you end up with a condition where your skin becomes yellow, called jaundice. Yeah, jaundice is usually indicative of some sort of liver damage. It happens when you can't process bilirubin fast enough, because you're making bilirubin at a pretty steady rate from the breakdown of red blood cells. Now there is one group of humans where jaundice is a fairly normal occurrence. Newborns, yeah, newborn jaundice is very common. One of the main reasons is that newborns' fetal hemoglobin is not the same as adult hemoglobin. It has a higher oxygen affinity. It needs that to get oxygen from the mother's body. But that means when you're born, your body has to change over all of that into adult hemoglobin, which means you've got a lot of bilirubin to deal with. Also, baby livers are a little immature. It's usually hard for them to handle it. So it's very common for newborns to have some level of jaundice. I am no doctor. My understanding is that mild newborn jaundice is considered harmless and passes on its own. If it's a little more severe, both my kids had moderate jaundice, and the doctor basically said, strip off their clothes, take them outside, and hold them up in the sun for about 15 hours, not 15 hours, 15 minutes a day. Make sure they get some sunlight, because sunlight in skin breaks down bilirubin. If that's not enough, I guess now they have incubators with Billy lights, and even blankets with lights, with UV lights sewn into them, so you wrap your baby up in them, they look like a little Tron burrito. And that way their skin can be exposed to it for a while. So, just... So anyway, lots of ways to deal with it, and assuming it's not severe, it passes normally. Any questions on that? Okay. That'll probably do for red blood cells. Let's take 5, and we've just got a little bit to talk about still.